Okay, everybody. Um, Welcome to class number 4 of neuropsychology. And I wanted, as a way of just starting off this class, because I know you have the exam that you're turning in this week, I wanted to make sure that everybody saw in the uh, material that I included that um, I'm sorry, the exam. Although in the material I'd written on the exam, one of the things I pointed out there is that the two articles that I gave you, sort of as introductions to neuropsychoanalysis, those were not on the test. Material from those articles were not on the test. I wrote that on there, but I want to make sure you saw that. So you do not have to have those articles in front of you when you're taking the test because none of the questions on the test were from those articles. I will, however, be using those articles for the next test. So please be prepared for that. So those two articles on neuropsychoanalysis, you will be um, you will be expected to use those and have those pretty well understood for the next exam. So the way things are pretty much going to work is this exam was mainly on the basics of neuropsychology. The next exam will basically be on the basics of neuropsychoanalysis. The third one will be on the basics of the neurological aspects of trauma and trauma therapy. And then the fourth exam will be comprehensive. It'll be on everything, plus include on any of those topics, plus on any of the topics that we cover. I believe it would be the last 2 weeks because you have an exam, class 4, class 6, class 8, class 10, or due 4, 6, 8, and 10. Okay. So let's talk about neuropsychoanalysis. Okay. And one of the reasons that I'm using those articles and will be planning to include some other articles in what we cover in here is because the book, the Schwartz book, is very good. I really like how it gives you a picture of where neuropsychoanalysis is falling into um, the sort of overall study of neuropsychology, the overall field of neuropsychology. And really, I'm hoping that you get a feel for neuropsychology, for all its promise, uh, ended up being its own field, separate from clinical psychology, and really studying the impact of brain damage, brain injury, brain disease on cognitive function, which is fine. Clinical neuropsychology did, which is fine. But this understanding of what we can do uh, with it as clinical psychologists, how it helps us as clinical psychologists uh, when we are not working with someone who has brain damage, when we are working with um, when we are working with individuals who, as far as we know, have, the mechanics of their brains are working fine. The all the lobes and neurons and all that are kind of working generally how they should. Um, but we're still working with individuals on helping them make changes, and understanding how the brain works helps us to understand how to help people make change. In the article I gave you from Psychotherapy Networker, I liked how it described it. It said that psychotherapists are the term I believe was neuroscientists, pragmatic neuroscientists. Regardless of what we do, we are trying to make changes in the person's mind, which means we're trying to make changes in the person's brain. There is umpteen amounts of evidence that therapy results in brain changes. And I brought up before to you the sort of chicken and the egg thing. Uh, did the therapy cause the neurochemical change in the brain, or did the neurological change in the brain lead to the person needing therapy? Uh, but for the most part, the evidence that we have supports a very strong piece of evidence that there are neurological changes in the brain that occur when somebody makes changes in psychotherapy, when they learn new habits of how to talk to themselves, when they are dealing with stressful situations, when they learn new new ways of dealing with emotionally difficult material, when they learn new ways of processing trauma, those all result in neurological changes. And you could say that, those neurological changes are one of the primary goals of therapy. We are looking for the pragmatic changes that occur um, when someone develops a deeper understanding of themselves, when someone learns more effective ways of handling challenges, when we learn new ways of processing past traumatic experiences or past emotionally overwhelming situations, when we learn ways to make the emotionally overwhelming not emotionally overwhelming anymore, when we learn ways of admitting to ourselves things that we have thought, things that we have felt, things that we have wanted in ways that aren't so catastrophic. Those are all things that we expect carry with them neurological changes. And the scientific evidence does show that there is neurological changes associated with that. So pragmatic, uh, pragmatic neuroscientist means that we are trying to bring about changes in the person's brain functioning without really knowing what that change looks like. So one of the prospects I thought was there for discussing neuropsychoanalysis, it would be interesting to look at what are those actual brain changes that are associated not only with how people function on a deep psychological level, but also what are some of the changes we are looking to bring about. Because maybe if we can understand what some of the changes are we're looking to bring about, we can find out better ways to actually bring those about. So that is why I wanted to bring up neuropsychoanalysis, why I wanted to bring up the neurological underpinnings of trauma therapy, because we are, whether we know what the changes are we're looking for or not, we are looking to bring about those brain changes that are consistent with changes in a person's functioning. Now, it does speak to something that's generally important to keep in mind about neuropsychology. Neuropsychology as a field is that neuropsychology has as its strength its focus on the practical aspects of brain behavior relationship. We are looking for the behavior part. We are looking for we are looking at the behaviors that often result from changes in brain chemistry and brain functioning and what's happening in the brain. We're looking for those changes. Now, we're focusing on those changes. Now, if you think of it that way, you see where all of this uh, has uh, its relationship to the general field of neuropsychology, because neuropsychology is looking at the behavior part of the brain behavior relationship. We are looking for the outcome without necessarily needing to see what the inner workings are. So we are making decisions about what the inner workings are by seeing how it's reflected in the person's behaviors. So we may not care so much because think about it. We would not care so much about what's going on in the prefrontal lobe if it didn't come out as the person's personality changing or as the person being unable to handle frustration without flipping out. We wouldn't care otherwise. If all it is something's going on different in the brain, there's probably billions of things going on differently in the brain every day that aren't reflected in problematic behaviors or in noticeable behavior changes. So we are looking at the behavior change. We know that those behavior changes often are centered in the brain, whether it's the brain by itself or the brain as part of the brain mind continuum. Uh, Something's happening in the brain. And so we are making conclusions about what's going on in the brain by what we observe from behavior. So across the board, that's what we're looking at. Whether we are looking at evaluating whether the person has Parkinson's disease or had a stroke based on their performance on memory and executive functioning tests, or whether we are looking at uh, trying to see if the person has learned more effective ways of dealing with intense stressors that they have every day. We are looking for evidence in the person's behavior of what's going on in their brain. And like I said, whether we want to consider it the brain totally just as the brain or brain as part of the brain slash mind combination. So that is what all of this has in common with neuropsychology. Neuropsychology is looking for the overt evidence of what's going on with the brain behavior relationship. We are looking, neurologists look more, remember the inside out, outside in sort of thing. Neurologists are looking more at the brain part of the brain behavior relationship. We are looking more at the behavior part of the brain behavior relationship. So, whether we are looking for it in terms of what's going on in therapy and trying to evaluate if there has been an effective process as part of therapeutic intervention, or whether we are looking for what has occurred because of brain trauma or brain disease. Either way, we are focusing on making conclusions about what's going on in the brain based on what we see in the person's behaviors. Okay. And so what I wanted to do today in this lecture was walk you through some of the basic tenets of neuropsychology, neuropsychoanalysis. Basically, what I want to look at are what were some of the findings? What are some of the reasons that this field started to develop? Basically, let's start talking about what happened. For neuropsychology as a separate field of study developed rather slowly. We talked about these. We and one of the reasons it developed very slowly is because for a long time, and this is important for understanding what happened with neuropsychology. For a long time, there wasn't really a clear distinction between clinical psychiatry and clinical psychology. Remember that the onslaught of medications really only started in the 60s. Um, Ramping up sometime in the late 50s, certainly in the 60s and the 70s, you get this like flood of psychiatric medications. But the ideas that exist now of psychiatrists being the one being primarily interested in psychiatric medications, and the psychologists, social workers, counselors, all those, the ones who are primarily doing psychotherapy, they were that distinction really didn't exist for a long time. So there really was this no real distinction of neuropsychology and neuropsychiatry. And since psychiatrists were medical doctors, there was much more of a focus on the brain part of the brain behavior relationship, but there was some interest in what were the overt behaviors that were coming out. And then in the 60s and 70s, you get this as psychiatry tends to become more of the medical model, you see that this field of neuropsychology does develop where there is less focus on like all the workings of what's going on in the brain and then trying to figure out how that comes out in behavior. There does become this interest in going from the outside in. Well, here are the behaviors. What could they be telling us about what's going on in the brain? More often because the thought was, well, if I can figure out what's going on in the brain by the behaviors, then maybe we can find some way to alter the behaviors and alter what's going on in the brain. So where there's this outside in approach. So, but initially, as this field starts to develop, there really is this focus of cognitive processes. Neuropsychology, for the longest time, was associated almost exclusively with cognitive processes, learning, memory, attention, abstract thinking. The quintessential neuropsychological test, other than the separate tests like the Halsted-Reitan and those sorts of tests, um, uh, was the IQ test. And that's because the IQ test tested almost all of the areas that are considered to be the primary avenues of neuropsychology. There's a measure of attention. There's a measure of general knowledge. There's a fund of knowledge, it's called. There's a measure of abstract thinking. There's a measure of social learning. So, really, the and you could, these neuropsychological batteries that I talk about, the Halsted-Reitan, the Loria, Nebraska, the ones that can take like 8 hours, and if you look at them, really all they are is just extended IQ tests. They're just an IQ test, and instead of taking 10 or each subtest on an IQ test takes about 10 or 15 minutes. Instead of taking 10, 15 minutes, they take an hour or two. They're just extensive IQ tests for the most part. So there really is this idea that the very basis of what's going on in the brain is the cognitive function. There's the idea of emotions and fight or flight coming from the amygdala, but it's seen as sort of a pretty straightforward process. But then 20, 30 years ago, you start to get a lot of research of the emotional processes. And there's a lot of research coming out showing how emotional processes in the brain are functioning on a much less direct level than, or are functioning on a much more multi-level uh, system than some of the cognitive processes. Although you also at the same time are getting a lot of research showing that memory works on much more multiple layers. So it's kind of like this mix. So late 90s, early 2000s, you start to get a pretty big bulk of material, not only in the complexity of how memory works in the brain and how emotions work in the brain, but also how they cross paths. So remember how in the Schwartz book, she talks about that some of the findings that come out in the scientific study of psychoanalysis shows that memory is malleable. We are not impacted by what actually happened. We're impacted by what we think happened and how we perceive what happened, which may or may not be 100% related to what actually happened in our past. So, some specific types of material that also starts to come up in this research is um, not only how emotions work, but that both with memory and with emotions, there is evidence of there being a disassociation between uh, conscious and non-conscious processes. So there is evidence that with memory and emotions both, and with emotional memories, there's this level of what we know, but then there's more evidence underneath of um, non-conscious. And remember, I told you um, in neuropsychoanalysis, uh, conscious and unconscious are still brought up, but are still used. But in neuropsychology and neuropsychological research that sort of tries to remove itself from the psychoanalytic constructs, it's often referred to as conscious and non-conscious. But there is a lot of evidence that there are processes that people are aware of in their memory and emotions, and also processes that that they are not aware of. And there's also there's even one thing that's talked a lot about in this scientific approach to um, understanding emotions and behavior is this concept of what is called unconscious will. And the idea of an unconscious will in the neuropsychological research is that there are personal goals that people have that operate out of their conscious awareness. So there is evidence that people are impacted by behaviors um, that that the person may not be consciously uh, so people consciously aware. So basically, people are motivated by things that are in their awareness, but also things that are tucked away more and that are in their non-conscious awareness. And without going, we can go into more details as we move on. But one thing that also, and this really starts to occur in the uh, late 1990s, early 2000, and one change that comes about in neuropsychology is remember how I talked about how the field of study back in the historical cases that occurred um, decades or a century or more ago, that those cases, one thing they started showing with neuropsychology is this idea of localization, that there are different parts of the brain that account for different things. And that certainly is true. But what becomes more, in order to understand how neuropsychoanalysis comes about and the whole role of neuroscience in understanding therapy, you have to realize that in the late 1990s or early 2000s, you start to get all this equipment. You go from CAT scans to MRIs to PET scans to fMRIs that really give you a full picture of the brain and what's going on. And what you start to do is actually see more of an interconnectedness between all the different parts of the brain. So, what happens in the brain is that you have different parts of the brain accounting for different activities. So there's still this idea of localization. But then what you start to also see is it's there's not only the brain parts that are uh, taking on their own roles, but there's a whole system of interconnectedness going on. And so what you start to see is that complex mental functioning are based on interactions between specialized brain systems. So you get this whole hierarchy of different functioning. Um, so what happens is you start, so it's like, it's like a map. You have the destinations, and those are important, but what's also important is the highway system that connects all the different destinations. And what leads to the complexity of how, let's say, how commerce works in our country is the interconnectedness of the different cities. So, you know, meat that's butchered in Chicago gets to different. That's how it winds up in Los Angeles. So you have this whole interconnectedness. So there started to be a lot more evidence of the interconnected. And by the way, that had always been the theory in neuropsychology. And that had always been the theory in neuropsychology. Loria, one of the famous researchers we talked about when we talked about the famous neuropsychiatric cases, theorized that back in his work, just that there's this interconnectedness of uh, of how the different parts of the brain work. But not only they're connected, that's important, but also the idea that there's a hierarchy system. So what you start to see, and why that's important, is you start to see that there are multiple systems working at any one time, only one of which may be in the front of where the person's aware. Everything else is sort of working beneath the surface. Um, so it's kind of um, uh, without dragging the analogy out too far. It's if you think about, I talked about how there are these big cities, these destinations and cities that certainly make up a large part of the how the country functions and how commerce in the country functions. But if you really want to understand how it functions, you not only have to understand the different destinations, also the highway systems, also the sewer systems, also the underground water sources that function from city to city and connect cities. So, you, you know, um, if you're talking about commerce, you may only give attention to the highway, but there's all these other things running underneath that play a role that are there, and you may only notice if um uh if something is a problem. Take for example, if you're wondering how what is how goods get from Dallas to Chicago, the highway system is going to be important until the sewer system in Chicago or Dallas bursts, and then you've got sewage flooding all over Dallas, and then that stops all the commerce whatsoever. So there's this whole so or the underground waterways dry up, and so you've got droughts um, in different places. So you or taking the other system, the airway systems above that nobody's looking at except nobody's watching the planes there. But then something happens, all the planes are grounded. So most of the time, if you're thinking of commerce, you're only looking at the highway system, but there are all these other systems that are having a role and are impacting, but you may not notice until they burst, and they may even be problematic. The sewer system might be outdated, and so it's causing a problem. You're just not noticing it as obviously. So there's this multi-level, this hierarchy of how much things are impacted. And that becomes analogous to how we see the brain function when we start to have all this higher technology of um, uh, all this technology that lets us see all this interconnectedness um, between the different parts of the brain and how they're connected and how they're, like I said, there's a hierarchy, there's different levels of what's happening. So, and by the way, it's interesting to keep in mind that this idea of there being this whole system of interconnectedness, um, which comes about now because we have evidence to show it, that was actually the view of the brain back in Freud's time. Thing was, they didn't have any way of actually seeing it unless you cut open someone's brain, and most of the time that could only happen when they were dead. They had neurosurgery back then, but and they did take, but to really study everything that was happening while it was happening, you usually couldn't do it. You could maybe study the pathways after the person was dead, but that was about it. But now we've got this whole ability to see all these processes going on while the brain is actually functioning. And so you really start to get a clear picture of the interconnectedness in the late 90s. And as you start to see that, you start to see that there's a hierarchy, there's conscious and non conscious impact on what is leading to a person's behaviors, what is leading to emotions. And um, so, in fact, there's so much. What's interesting to keep in mind is that there's so much material coming out. There really isn't yet a whole lot of agreement about what it means. Um, so, uh, so what happens is what you have is a lot of neurological research coming out from brain imaging studies and mathematical models and genetic studies and all that good stuff. What you have coming out is a lot of evidence of things like really complex motivational systems, what leads us to do things, a stronger understanding of social influences on development of the brain and mind, evidence of a strong interconnection between the different parts of the brain, especially when it comes to memory and emotions. So all of those are coming out. It's the psychoanalysts who are kind of taking all that and saying, okay, this fits in with what we have been saying all along. And the neurologists may or may not agree with that. I mean, but there isn't a real strong understanding of what all the research evidence coming out means. The neuropsychoanalysts bring up one way of looking at it, and it's an interesting complex scenario. One I remember from Schwartz's book is where she talks about how she goes in with uh, the famous neuropsychologist when they were in South Africa, and they go on to the unit where he worked as a neuropsychologist. Which, by the way, one of the things I found interesting about the issue when she's in South Africa with him is that the hospital where he practiced as a neuropsychologist barely knew that he was a psychoanalyst. His job there was as a neuropsychologist. So they knew he was a neuropsychologist, but they didn't know fully that he was a psychoanalyst or what that even meant. So it was interesting how he was bringing in these psychoanalytic concepts, but because they saw him as a neuropsychologist at the hospital, they interpret them as neuropsychological concepts. But where they go and see that woman who had left side paralysis because of a brain injury, and she talked about not recognizing that she had any problems, but she talked about how much she loved her left hand. And it was interesting that the individuals that he took on the tour all brought it up as she had a lack of awareness of her disease. And he brought up the interesting question of, is it possible that she has a lack of awareness, or is it possible that she's denying that she had the disease? Because if she had a total lack of awareness of her disease, would she be mentioning her left hand? Would it stand out to her that anything had happened to her left hand, or that there was any real reason to notice her left hand? It would suggest that the only real reason to notice her left hand would be if on some level she noticed something was wrong with the left side of her body. And he talks about how he expects that if they could have more of an understanding of, if they could have more time with her, basically get more of an understanding what she's going through, she might mention her left hand even more and the meaning of her left hand, which would suggest that it's less a neurological damage causing her to be unaware of her illness, and more on some level her being aware of her illness but denying it or repressing it or not wanting to admit to it. So it's interesting there, where you see even with the neurologically impaired individual, the concept of how there are still possibly psychodynamic factors at work. So now that's kind of it. One of the things that I find particularly interesting about that is because there is a lot of debate about what is going on with some of the brain studies showing evidence of um, uh, the brain studies showing evidence of non-conscious processing and evidence of there being things going on in the brain that are consistent with psychoanalytic concepts. And some people just strongly disagree with that. And it's interesting that one of the arguments that neurologists make, either neurologists or psychoanalysts, ones who don't see any connection between the two, is that where there is meaning in what people do, neurology can have no say. That's sort of the argument. And that when the brain is the primary uh, factor, when brain injury is the primary factor, then psychoanalysis has nothing to say. But you could probably, and without getting too simplistic on that argument, you could see the limitation to it. People who have brain injuries don't stop being human. And why would the things that make us human not, why would the things that make us human stop just because something happens to our brain? Would that not more than anything sort of bring into the forefront some of these processes that have kept us functioning? Because it's at its very base, you have a stroke, something happens to you, it all of a sudden now is a major thing that you are dealing with. And so you would think that all of the sort of emotional issues you've been dealing with and emotional processes that have served you um, are now going to come even more uh, into play. So you you start to wonder if if the attempt to keep um, if the attempt to keep psychoanalytic thinking and neurological thinking totally separate, if it may be an attempt to sort of compartmentalize things too much and to cause too much of a difficulty in terms of seeing just how complex human behavior is. So, and I thought that example from the book is a good example because it shows that um, even though the person that they were looking at had a neurological injury, a stroke, there is still reason to believe that there are psychoanalytic processes going on, and that just because one thing happened doesn't mean the other thing completely shut down. So now, what I wanted to talk about next here is, I've talked about all this findings and everything, and I wanted to talk about one specific area of study in neurology and findings in neurology that have had a lot of impact on this thinking about psychodynamic, psychoanalytic factors as they impact on human behavior, and has to do with what has become to emerge in recent decades about how memory works. And the idea is that memory is not a unitary phenomenon. It's not all on one level, but it's actually mediated by a number of different systems. And only one of those systems um, relates to conscious memories that can be recalled as personal events and expressed in words. And that's called the declarative memory system, or it's otherwise known as the explicit memory system. So there is this thing called the declarative memory system, which is the conscious memory system. And that had always been the thinking of memory. What was found in more recent decades and a lot of more recent neurological research is that there are other uh, memory systems, and they are called implicit memory systems. So the main one is called the explicit memory system, but then there's other systems that are called the implicit memory systems. And they are some of the implicit memory systems that are not always in the person's conscious mind, is not always something the person is aware of. Implicit memory systems are things that control abilities and habits. Um, Also, ones that encode emotional responses to people and places, and also ones that encode pleasant feelings that are generated by certain stimuli. And if you think about some of the, if you think about habits, habits are almost by definition non-conscious. We don't necessarily recognize that they're being encoded or that they're there. A good example of a habit that's run by an implicit memory system is the ability to ride a bicycle. Most people after a certain point couldn't actually tell you how they ride a bicycle. They just ride a bicycle. And it's also riding a bicycle is a good example because it's a very clear cut uh, example of an implicit memory system that we're all kind of aware of, because this idea that it's sort of there underneath conscious comes out in the idea that people say that you never forget how to ride a bike. That even if you haven't done it for a long time, it's there. So when you hop on the bike, even if you haven't ridden one for 10 years, the habit comes back. You remember how to do it. So, what has been found in recent decades is a lot of evidence of these implicit memory systems, and that only the explicit memory system has to do with overt, um, overt um, uh, learning over memory, conscious, in other words, conscious memory. Only the declarative memory system is found to be one that the person is always aware of. Other ones are these implicit memory systems that work underneath the surface. Um, Now, one thing that has come out since the late 90s, where there has been a lot of research showing that it functions very strongly on an implicit memory system, is fear conditioning. And what's been found a lot is that people often develop an intense fear of people, places, or things without necessarily having an explicit memory of why they fear it. And what's interesting about the material that's been found on that, and I'm reading just from some notes I have here from a journal, from an article. It is important to note that the corresponding implicit memory here is not repressed. It never existed in the first place. It isn't encoded in the brain. Uh, so there is a lot of evidence that people may develop fear from certain events that occur in their life without necessarily ever having processed uh, what the reasons were for developing the fear in the first place. So it's it's this idea that, so I apologize, I paused, I forgot exactly where I stopped last time, but so there is this evidence that, especially for particularly emotionally traumatic events, the person may develop the fear connection, but may not actually remember what was happening. And you could see that. I mean, that's not necessarily, it's interesting that it's neurological evidence of what some of us may expect on a common sense level is going to be there. You know, if someone is being abused or is suffering trauma, their focus may be so much on the fear that they may not be piecing together exactly what happens. But um, from a psychoanalytic point of view, it really does support this idea of the importance of transference. Remember that transference is where the individual is um, playing out their response on an emotional level to the therapist, with the therapist. And so um, that takes on an even more important role if therapy, you know, too often in therapy, people think we're trying to help them explain where things come from. Every patient, or not every, but a lot of patients I've had in therapy will say, "Well, I don't know why I act this way." And of course, a lot of times I have to respond with some version of, "Well, of course you don't know. If you knew, you wouldn't be here." But it is possible that for some of the more traumatic things that our patients experience, they may actually not remember. It may not. It's not they can't. It just isn't there. I mean, it's not that they're repressing it or refusing. It just isn't there. And so it is interesting that when you take on this idea of it, if it's not going to be there, if the memory of where it came from isn't going to be there, then the focus has to be more on helping the individual come to grips with its impact, even if they don't know what the impact was, or what it was that had led to the impact. But what they know is so it's almost like you don't know the cause, but you know the effect. The effect is, and so transference then becomes this um, necessity of working on in therapy of, well, I don't know how you got here, but I know what you're doing, and let's see if we can come to grips with where this is coming from, even if in the end, all we can really remember or help you remember is the emotional response that you had to it without necessarily being able to say in detail what actually occurred. So, you know, there is this, so you've got the declarative memory system where um, where it's the only part that's conscious. But then you've got these multiple implicit memory systems that not only focus on the person recalling material that may not be verbalized in their conscious, but also maybe a system that's running on an emotional response where the memory of what led to the emotional response was never encoded in the first place. So it may, I don't, so it's almost like a pure emotional memory. So there's these implicit memory systems where the person learned things, but they're not conscious. They don't even know, they're not even saying in words what happened. But then there's this other memory system that may be running entirely on emotion. There's no actual factual information in there other than just the emotional response to what happened. So there's these multiple layers of memory, only one of which is conscious and verbal, and then everything else is um, habitual, emotional, um, uh, social, but not necessarily factual and word based. Okay, so that's a good place to stop, and we'll pick this up on Thursday.